Oh, hello. Welcome to the 2013 Hundie Challenge. Today we're going to be discussing Call Me Lightning by Willem Dafoe. Dee-doo-dee-doo-doo, dee-doo-doo-doo-doo-dee-doo-doo-doo. Dee-doo-dee-doo-doo, dee-doo-doo-doo-dee-doo-doo-doo. So lots of stuff to discuss today. In case you couldn't tell, this Light in August is an audiobook. It's not the first audiobook I've ever read / listened to. I did listen to Mostly Harmless once in middle school, but I'd already read the book, so it wasn't like I was coming into it, for the first time via that means. It is the first audiobook I've listened to, cold. And I mentioned a couple weeks ago I was going to start doing this to try and find more time in the day for this challenge. And that's been good because, that opens up my whole commute to reading. So a couple of things came out of this. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and say that my opinion on Faulkner has changed because this was actually a good book. I wish I had read it first, and maybe that would have given me a better baseline for the more experimental Faulkner that apparently was to come. I do not change my opinion that The Sound and the Fury is far and away one of the worst books I've ever read, and As I Lay Dying was not better, just shorter. But that being said, I guess there is, good Faulkner to be found. About the method, let's talk a little bit. This book seemed overly long. And I'm wondering if that's because it's 16 hours of listening to a guy with a thick southern accent talk it to me. In a way, I felt like it illuminated things. It may be that if I had had the opportunity and had listened to As I Lay Dying, as spoken, I might have gotten more out of it. But this didn't seem like an experimental book at all. It seemed a little bit of time changing, yeah, but nothing like, from the perspective of a mentally ill person or anything like that. The time switches were kind of organic. It was like as we introduced a character, we learned his whole family history. Now that did get a little grating after a while, because by the time I'm starting to get to the end of the CDs, the book, if you want, I'm like, oh, here's a character on the street that we're going to introduce and tell his whole family's backstory and their life stories. And I'm like, I get it. And I get what he was doing. He was kind of trying to... It's a book less about a single couple of people as about how we're all connected. Everybody in a town and a country, is connected. The people from the carpetbaggers, I guess they would call them, are connected to the locals in Georgia and that sort of thing. So listening to it had its ups and its downs. I'm not sure what to tell you. I enjoyed hearing it that way because it was more passive. And definitely the guy who did it, I want to say Mark Hamill, but I know that's actually Luke Skywalker. Mark Hammer was a very good actor. And he had a different voice for every character and all that sort of thing. It made it relatively easy to follow. But as I said, Faulkner is constantly switching back and forth between characters. And you reach a point where you're like, who's he? He's just going on talking about he or she and just going on about a person who I might have missed initially who it was supposed to be. And Hammer only diverges so much. He's not doing women's voices when he's being a woman or anything. He just has a different voice for everyone. So in a lot of ways, the method of transmittal, contributed to my enjoyment of this book. But it also made it feel like, I've been listening to it for 5 weeks. It seems endless. I don't know how long it would have taken. I think 5 or 6 days if I had read it straight through, but that wouldn't have been at 20 minutes a pop, so on and so forth. Whatever. You don't care about that. Well, maybe you do. I don't know. it's interesting hearing what people think of audiobooks. Tell me what you think of audiobooks in the comments. As for this book itself, it seemed like, I almost want to say, a satire of social norms, because a lot of it was like about how if somebody was just a little bit odd or just didn't behave quite right, they will be ostracized in the South. There's so many characters. I guess you want to say the main character is Joe Christmas. And Joe Christmas is what we kind of, I guess in the 60s or whatever, would have called passing. He has black blood. I think he was only actually a quarter black, but he was passing as white. And he has kind of an identity crisis throughout the whole book, but it's kind of purely man-made. It's only when people recognize that he has black blood that he runs into issues. And he ends up becoming a murderer, and you sort of get the impression that, well, it was either him or Joe Brown. Well, that was a little, whatever. We're not sure who the actual murderer was, but assuming it was Christmas, we get the impression that that was because of the way society had treated him, and the black people, considered him white, and the white people considered him black, and he couldn't pick out which identity he wanted to choose, and he kind of went with the flow and went with whatever was most convenient, or sometimes just like perversely what was least convenient, or to mess with people. Like he would sleep with a white woman and then tell them later he was black because it was such a horrible thing in the 30s. So he was kind of ostracized because of who he was. Then there's the story of the woman that he ended up shacking up with and murdering, either him or his compatriot. We're not sure who actually committed the murder. And this woman was a carpetbagger. Anyway, she was considered a carpetbagger because her parents moved down from the north and they were abolitionists. She had been born in the town of Jefferson, lived her whole life in the town of Jefferson, and was still considered a northerner and an outsider, and nobody was interested in her. So she was ostracized because of that, which had nothing to do with her. It focused on none of her choices as a person, but just because of where her parents came from. Then we have this weird Reverend Hightower, who was a good old Southern boy whose grandfather had fought in the Civil War. And as it turns out later, we find out he didn't really fight. He was a preacher who kind of died ignominiously. But anyway, Hightower thought of his grandfather as a good old son of the South. And because Hightower kind of gave weird sermons and was always talking about his grandfather, they kicked him out. They kind of tarred and feathered him. Not literally, but they were kind of get the hell out of town. But Hightower said, no, I want to live in Jefferson. And so he just kind of was like, nope, I'm going to stay here. And you get the impression that if he had left, he would have been fine. But he was just kind of living in exile within his own hometown because he wouldn't conform and the people didn't like him. It's all about exiles and outcasts, and there's a woman. It's all kind of centers around this woman, Lena Graves, who's pregnant by Joe Brown, who's Joe Christmas's compatriot, maybe also the murderer. This sounds really complicated when I'm explaining it. And she knows him as Lucas Birch. And when she's pregnant, she goes off searching for Lucas Birch, and they all tell him, oh, we think Lucas Birch is up in Jefferson. Turns out he is, but he was going by the name Joe Brown. But everyone was telling her to go to Jefferson because of this guy, Byron Bunch. And Byron, I guess, he's the least outcasty of the characters, because, Lena was an outcast because she was pregnant without being married. Ooh, what a tragedy. But Byron was a normal kind of unassuming guy in the town until he decided that he was going to be nice to Lena, and then the town didn't want anything to do with him. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of an interesting satire of like, small town life and kind of an analysis of that time period. Like I said, it's the best Faulkner book I've read. It's the last Faulkner book on this list. I'm sorry in a sense that I read it last, but I'm also glad in a sense because it kind of redeemed that I don't have to, for the rest of my life, say I hate every book I ever read of Faulkner's. I can at least say, oh, well, Light in August was pretty good. I don't know if I whole-throatedly recommend it. Be very wary of the N-word. I didn't read it but page by page, but I would go so far as to say it's probably showing up 10, 15 times a page, which I do not like, and I had to roll around with my car windows rolled up and the air conditioning on for the past month and a half. But as a Faulkner book, it's the best Faulkner book I've read so far. As an audiobook, an interesting experience, and maybe more to follow when I read more audiobooks. Thanks for tuning in. Next time we'll hit up another Red Adept publication. If you've been tracking the blog, you know what I'm talking about with that. And after that, I think will be I, Claudius by Robert Graves. Thanks for tuning in.